In this short video, I will answer the question whether or not the seller is entitled to receive a copy of the property inspection or the appraisal. The answer can be found in the residential purchase agreement, specifically paragraph 12B. I'll read the text, which is a little dense, and then we'll discuss. It says, the seller shall make the property available for all buyer investigations. Buyer shall, 1, as specified in paragraph 14B, which is the inspection investigation period, complete buyer investigations and either remove the contingency or cancel this agreement. And 2, give seller, now this is the key, give seller at no cost complete copies of all such investigation reports obtained by buyer, which obligation shall survive the termination of this agreement. That means even if the buyer cancels, the buyer is still obligated and the seller is still entitled to receive any inspections that the buyer obtained throughout the investigation period. Now, there's another sentence in here that is part of this paragraph that it's worth mentioning, and that's that the seller shall have water, gas, and electricity and all operable pilot lights on for the buyer investigations. This is important too because sometimes sellers have it shut off or it was off for whatever reason prior to going into escrow. A buyer's agent should hold a seller accountable and make sure that all these utilities are on, so that proper investigations can be conducted. Because if any of these utilities is not on and the buyer's investigation doesn't show that there's an issue and escrow closes and there is an issue, that creates a problem, and at that point it's the buyer's fault. All right, now that we've established that the seller is in fact entitled to all buyer investigations, the answer is yes. One of the reasons is that, now keep this in mind, if a seller gets any report or any sort of inspection, and I know property inspection from the property inspector that comes out, sometimes it's called a physical inspection, that is the primary buyer inspection. There are also mold inspections or roof inspections or something that relates to, let's say, a structural inspection that has to do with if the property has a crack in the foundation. You get the idea. Any such inspection is due the seller. The buyer has an obligation, the seller's entitled. And once the seller gets that inspection from the buyer, let's say that buyer cancels, any additional buyer in the future, let's say the first escrow falls apart, the buyer cancels, the seller then goes into escrow with buyer number 2 or a backup offer. The seller's obligated to furnish those inspections from buyer number 1 to buyer number 2. There's an obligation. The seller's been made aware. The buyer's been compelled through the RPA to give the seller the inspections. The seller's been made aware, and the seller is then obligated to give those to buyer number 2 as a disclosure. All right, now that we've established that the seller's entitled to all buyer inspections, what about the appraisal? Because this comes up too. The answer is not really, but there's an exception. An appraisal that is just for the purpose of the buyer to obtain a mortgage, sometimes the buyer doesn't even see a copy of that. Now, the exception, I would say, and this isn't explicitly mentioned in the RPA, but this is my own belief as someone that does compliance. Some appraisals show that there are defects in the property. It can be something as minor as the carbon monoxide detector not installed or missing, or the smoke detector not installed or missing. It could be damage to the roof or awnings or something to that effect. Let's call it wood damage or something else. And the appraiser will identify these defects, and the lender then makes that a condition for the loan's approval. This compels the buyer to go to the seller and say, I need these repairs done. I personally don't care, but my lender does. This is what the buyer's saying. They're saying it's the lender's request, not mine. Well, if a buyer's agent is sending a request for repairs, it's always in my opinion appropriate to include the respective inspection that identifies the defect. So if it's items that come up in a property inspection, then I think it's proper form for the buyer's agent to include that inspection with the request for repairs. If there's a defect in the appraisal report, I believe that the seller should in fact see it, because the buyer's making the seller aware of a defect, that it exists in documentation, the appraisal, and therefore a copy should be sent to the seller so they can see this defect on their own, because in effect, this appraisal has become a buyer investigation. It's not simply the lender verifying the value of the asset for collateral purposes. It's now turned into an inspection, or has an inspection component regarding the condition of the property. So in general, an appraisal isn't required to be given to the seller. However, I would say if the appraisal identifies defects in the property, then I would say yes. That's the exception. That's why I put not really. If you have any questions about this matter, feel welcome to email info@balboateam.com or visit our website, balboateam.com. I do hope that you found this informative, and thank you for watching.